I usually try to plan videos out when I do them for my YouTube channel, and this is not a video I had hoped to do. I am in my appliance store, and we had a flood. If you are in Ohio or Michigan in late May, you know that there were a bunch of storms and there was flooding. This is a day after the flood, after we've pumped out some of the water, but not all of it. I did not take any video on the day of the flood, but this entire business was totally underwater. Appliances weren't like totally covered, but they were kind of bad. So we're going to do a video on if we can fix appliances after a flood. This row here of laundry is what I had available for customers that was good, working, and testing. I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 laundry units, and then a stove. And then quite a few other units we were testing, but for this video, we're going to, I guess, mainly focus on some laundry, and then we're going to do some fridges. Now, if you want to know how high the water was, this should be able to give you kind of an idea. And of course, cardboard soaks water for sure, but it was at least up to about here, maybe even up a little bit more. But it was definitely enough to cause some issues potentially on refrigerators and laundry and stuff. So it's kind of good to know if these things are going to work or not, and make a video of it, because my loss will hopefully be your gain on good practices when it comes to cleaning appliances after a flood. What we're going to do is let these dry out for a few days and kind of do a journal on what we can fix. Hey guys, so it's been about 10 days since I did the last video talking about the flood damage that was here. I was hoping to do everything step by step on how we were going through the process of flooding, but unfortunately one of the buildings on the other side of this complex ended up getting flooded a whole lot worse than the appliance store did. On top of that, I had a tech that worked for me die, and of course all the regular coronavirus stuff that's going on throughout the country, so I did no recording. But I'm telling you that not to really gain any sort of sympathy, but to tell you that we recovered about 95% of the appliances that we were hoping we could salvage from this whole mess with the flood. And if I can do it with what we have here at this building, then you can do it with whatever flood damage you have. So here we go on what we did to salvage the appliances in each type of appliance with different steps. The first thing you want to do to try to salvage your appliances is make sure all your breakers are turned off before you try to do any sort of recovery. The church beside us did not turn the main breaker off, and I think it cost them quite a few appliances. And if you haven't had flood damage and can remember it if you've watched this video, please make sure to turn off as much of your breakers as possible to prevent electricity from going through them. It is a good first step, especially if you have refrigerators, because there's a lot of electricity going underneath. So step one, turn your breakers off to try to save your appliances. The second step to the process of dealing with your flooding, again, kind of has nothing to do with appliances, but make sure that you have dehumidified or got as much moisture out of the building that is flooded as possible. We used 2 or 3 of these giant patent fans to blow out as much moisture as possible, along with dehumidifiers, sump pumps, anything I could get my hands on. Again, it's 10 days past the flooding, but we spent probably the first 7 days just drying crap out. Now, if you only have 1 or 2 appliances, you can use your dehumidifier or your fans directed on that specific appliance. But in my case, I don't have that luxury to do 1 or 2 appliances at a time, so we're doing a whole lot at once. So again, get the moisture down as fast as you can, as good as you can. The appliances we had here weren't in standing water for super long. The total amount of water was about 6 inches in the entire building. It was up past the vent pipes on, say, the dryer. So we did get quite a bit of flooding. It wasn't apocalyptic, but it took us, like I said,
5 or 6 days to get the water down to almost nothing. I still got some standing water in the building right now, but it's very, very minimal. However, after that period of time, we were able to start looking at the appliances and seeing what we had to do to fix them. And one of the ways that you can hopefully get the moisture down outside of your fans or whatever devices you use to get the moisture out is making sure that you open up your appliance in any way, shape, or form to try to get more air into it. If there are panels underneath it, or if there are cabinets or anything that you can use to get more and more airflow throughout the items. There's a lot of hidden crevices in a lot of appliances. The more dehumidifying you can get out of them, the better it's going to be for your appliance. They can withstand some water because, you know, washers and dryers deal with that all the time, but the less moisture you have on these things, the better. One of the biggest appliances that we were worried about here were our refrigerators. Every single one of them was running and plugged in when we had this flood. So when I got in my shop, the first thing I did was, of course, cut the power. Because of the way that these refrigerators are structured, a lot of your electricity is underneath. So being able to terminate the power increases the chances of you being able to save any of these machines. And fortunately, we were able to save practically all of them because we were able to cut the power to them before the floodwaters got really bad. But if you're not able to cut the power immediately, there's still a chance of saving them, but you do have to follow a few steps to try to get as much moisture out of them as possible. One of the biggest issues with any refrigerator is the compressor panel that is on the back underneath the fridge. This is where the power cord on practically every refrigerator I've seen is. So it means that there's a lot of active, scary electricity underneath the refrigerator. So the one way you want to improve your chances of saving the machine before you plug it in is to unscrew everything involved with this panel. This one is like a plastic panel. Some are metal, some are cardboard. And if you can save the panel, you want to do that because they're there for a reason to help the compressor cool down properly. But if it is a cardboard, it's ruined. So go ahead and take a screwdriver. I have an Irwin 9-in-1 here that I use for a lot of stuff, and just remove this panel to access what's underneath. A lot of moisture is going to stay in here during the flood, so there's a few other steps you want to take once this panel's off. This is the underneath panel that we have on this Crossley refrigerator. Once the back is off, you can kind of inspect to see where your moisture is. The one place you want to worry about the most is the relay and capacitor here. That is the electronic part that actually connects to your compressor unit. Sometimes, in the worst case scenarios, you may want to inspect this piece and replace it if it is bad. Again, that's where a lot of your electricity comes in and is the most vulnerable part on most refrigerators. This one does not have any sort of electronic control board. Some of them have them on the back, roughly here, on GEs and Frigidairs and a few other models. So if you have an electronic board that could be exposed, you want to make sure to check for water or moisture damage. One of the other things with this type of unit is the black condenser coils can get dirt on them. So you want to make sure that if you have a compressor brush, to clean these out really, really good, to make sure that your unit works efficiently. If you don't have a condenser brush, I do have some really cheap ones in the comments for people to buy if they need them. With the back panel exposed and hopefully the water drying from out underneath, one of the issues that we did have with a few of our fridges is that the defrost trays that are directly underneath accumulated a huge amount of water underneath them. So one of the big catches with the refrigerator is it loves to hold water underneath. So if you are running into an issue with refrigerators, I would suggest trying to gently tip them to the left, to the right, to the front, to the back, just a little bit to loosen up some of the water. And of course, there's going to be water damage underneath, but if you've been in a flood, then it kind of doesn't matter at this point, right? So just take the fridge, at least in my amateur opinion, and just tip it to see if any water actually comes out from underneath or beside it. Again, you want to make sure as much moisture as possible to get out of this before you fire it back up. I waited 5, 6, 7 days roughly, depending on the unit that's in our store, and we had no issues with the refrigerators, which I was really scared about because we had some nice ones that were plugged in running with the display panels and everything on them with 6 or 7 inches of standing water. And somehow it wasn't enough to damage the unit. So we had really good success on these. Some units do have special computer boards, inverters that are onto the compressors. So you have to take extra care if there's any sort of like sealed or unsealed electronics on these sorts of units, but they are salvageable. When it comes to a washing machine, the one and only nice thing about them is the fact they're used to water. However, when you're in a flood situation, components tend to get wet that normally don't get wet, namely the motor that is underneath the unit, which could include an inverter board, which again is electronic, and if there's any electronics, it's a major concern. However, as long as it dries out well enough, you're okay. There are a lot of holes typically underneath most washers that will allow the water to drain out. So we found out with our flooded units that there was very little standing water underneath once the flooding had receded. So our main goal was to try to get air up and underneath the units to try to dry the motors out. Again, if you have electronics, that's a major concern. Motors are also a big concern. The only appliance I lost, I believe, was a laundry unit because the motor shorted out. So far so good on what we have been able to do, but make sure your motors are taken care of and dried out really well underneath. Otherwise, when you think you've dried them out enough, you can just run a standard cycle through them. Having them plugged in during a flood isn't as big of a concern as refrigerators because most of your electricity is going to run through the board first and then down to the motor. So as long as you don't start a wash cycle on one of these things in the middle of a flood, good chance of recovery. But if the motor's too saturated or a board has too much water on it, again, it could short out, but I've had really good luck, fortunately. Remember how I said that we saved almost every single unit, 95%? Well, this is the one that we did not save. It is still having some issues. It will run, but it won't heat. So I'm going to take the underneath the panel and kind of show you what happened to this unit to give you an idea of what we did or didn't do right on this. And again, I just got my standard Irwin 9-in-1 here, which I use for practically everything. So we're still trying to actually trace this one down. I think we're still going to be able to save it, but at least in terms of the fact that we ran about 30 to 35 appliances so far, this is the one that's confirmed having issues still. We tried to do everything we could to keep the moisture down, but I'd never removed the bottom rocker panel from this when we were drying it out, and maybe that was part of the issue, that we didn't get enough water out of it and caused some sort of short to it. We've been able to run a lot of other dryers, some even without the rocker panels, and they've been fine. But it's part of what may happen. So again, make sure you try to dehumidify as much as possible. And if you're only dealing with 1 or 2 appliances, you can probably spend more time than we could on making sure they're super duper bone dry. Some dryers have the rocker panel like this, where you can just take it from the bottom out. Other ones you're going to have to deal with on the top. Of course, I have a few videos on how to take these things apart to fix them. So just make sure that if you have the time, take them apart just a little bit. You don't have to disassemble the entire unit to get it dry. Just any panel will work to hopefully get underneath and get some of the moisture out. We saved probably like 10 or 15 dryers overall, but this was the one that we couldn't do it. So hopefully you have some ideas on dryers. The final appliance that we're dealing with in terms of flood damage are stoves. This is actually not a stove that I've really dealt a whole lot with, because all the good stoves that we had that got flooded ended up testing out okay and were sold almost immediately after the flood. Stoves out of all of the appliances tend to be the most flood resistant, at least from what we dealt with, simply because there is no circuitry underneath, at least as far as any of the ones I have dealt with. All your circuitry's up top, and when it comes to the terminal block, it sits about a foot above the ground, so you do have some area to work with in terms of physical constraints when it comes to avoiding floods. Now, we're going to show you the place you do need to worry about on these, outside of making sure that you don't have current running to the unit, because that does get dicey. If it is plugged in, if there is voltage going to it, it could short out because the terminal block is lower on these. So that is a cautionary tale. But in terms of what we had to deal with only getting 6, maybe 7 inches of water, nothing happened to our stoves, and we actually had them up, running, and sold 3 days because we just had to wipe them down. And this is the terminal block where your typically normal power cord is going to come into. This will send your voltage up to your stove. Now, if the water never gets up this high, which is roughly, I don't know, almost a foot, you are not going to have any issues whatsoever. If it does get up to here, you want to make sure that the terminals are good and the spades are good, and of course making sure it dries out. Now, I will say there is a caveat. If it gets much higher, you come up to where your heating element is, and it could, excessive moisture could short these out. But what I would be more concerned about is your insulation. If the water gets in your insulation, it's going to get soaked, and you will need to make sure that that dries out really, really well before you use it regularly. I am not going to confirm or deny you could turn it on and use it to warm up the cabinet. We did not test that. I guess that's something you could consider doing, but I would be concerned about your insulation getting ruined. If you follow the wires up, you're going to see there's a lot of room before you physically get to the console, which does give you some breathing room on a flood. And that's it for the quick tutorial on how to deal with flood damage. Again, we had a lot of appliances here that we had to go through and test. Most of the appliances we had were able to be saved. You may not be able to have a flawless record, which we certainly did not, but there is hope if you have a flood. Now, again, if you're watching this before you've had a flood, make sure to cut all the power that you can as fast as you can to save yourself hopefully a lot of trouble and grief. And it's not just with appliances, it's with anything that has electronics on it. If water gets in it, it could short out, and if it shorts out, you're done. So please make sure to follow that. And again, Dehumidify, I appreciate you guys watching the channel. It's been great being able to do all these videos with you. Make sure you watch the next one that comes out.